special comment that I'm very happy to be here in Mexico City. It's my first time in Mexico City. It's my first time in Mexico, and it's a wonderful place, and I'm very grateful to the people who've gone out of their way to make this such a wonderful visit. And so I just want to say thank you. Today I want to talk about an issue that Paola asked me if I would address for this group that I understand has special interest in the philosophy of biology. And this part of the talk today is related to a paper that I published some time ago called Mechanisms in Natural Kinds. I've also published a paper with Ken Kendler in the American Journal that are the basic operations in the function of the human mind and the human brain. So a classic story would go that we, at some point, I'm not sure when, thought that memory was a unitary, single phenomenon, but then from learning from people like HM and KC, we've come to subdivide memory into many different types. We can distinguish short-term memory from long-term memory. Short-term memory should be listed here at the top. Something's happened to the slide. And then on the basis of studying people like KC, we learned that declarative memory is distinct from non-declarative memory, that one can lose declarative memory while keeping one's non-declarative memories intact, procedural memory, for example. And then within declarative memory, patients like KC have taught us that one can lose episodic memory, but maintain semantic memory. And on the basis of findings like this, we hope to take a very primitive ontology for cognitive science and then refine it by breaking it into units that we take to be the basic operations. And once we've done that, we'll have the elements that can be composed into cognitive molecules that explain human behavior and human cognition quite generally. And of course, in psychiatry, this is also an important task, and one that's really fraught with much controversy, of course. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which now is in its 5th edition, it represents the latest set of carvings of the world of mental health into basic ways that minds can break or go wrong. And every time this book comes out, there's a new set of kinds, and some kinds disappear and new kinds appear. Old kinds are split into many other kinds. And philosophically, I'm interested in the question, are there rules for doing this correctly? And if so, what are those rules? And unfortunately, I have to confess from the start that my results today are largely depressing, that I won't have concrete rules for you, but I will consider one very plausible way of addressing this issue that I think for philosophical reasons simply will not provide an adequate theory of natural kinds, much as I would want it to. And then hopefully by the end of this talk I'll have something, there's a section that I added this morning where I'll try to explain how we might try to proceed in the absence of any well-defined notion of natural kinds in psychiatry, in cognitive science, in the special sciences generally. And the view that I want to consider is a view that's due to Richard Boyd, which he calls the homeostatic property cluster view of natural kinds. And this view of natural kinds fits very nicely with the work that I've done on scientific explanation. For those of you who were at either of the last two talks, you'll know that I embrace a mechanistic theory of scientific explanation, and I've spent the last 15 or more years attempting to develop an account of what mechanisms are and how we discover mechanisms and how mechanisms function in explanations. So when I found out about Boyd's homeostatic property cluster view, because it relies fundamentally on the concept of mechanism, I thought, here's a very nice view of natural kinds that I might be able to borrow and would fit very nicely with the ontology that I've been developing. So I tried to do that, and I want to tell you today why I didn't think it worked. So according to Boyd, natural kinds are, we'll walk through some of the details of this in just a second, but natural kinds are clusters of properties that co-occur with one another, and they co-occur with one another because there's a mechanism that explains why they co-occur. So they're clusters of properties that co-occur with one another because there's a similarity-generating mechanism that binds those properties together, as it were. And Boyd considers things like species as natural kinds, bound together by inheritance and facts about evolution. And part of what's interesting to me in Boyd's view is whether this view could actually provide some normative weight for thinking about when cognitive scientists should split kinds and when they should put them together, when the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual could split kinds and put them together. So the thought here that falls out of Boyd's is that the correct taxonomy in a domain, the correct ontology in a domain, describes phenomenal kinds that correspond to the mechanisms constituting the causal structure of the world. So if we can figure out where the mechanisms are, we would know where the kinds are, and the mechanisms can be a guide for us as to whether we're dealing with one kind or many. And the point of all of this, of course, the reason why kinds are thought to be so important for the sciences is that kinds are thought to be useful for prediction. Kinds tell us when things are similar enough that we can make similar predictions about how they will behave. And those kinds are also thought to function fundamentally in our explanations. If we want to explain psychiatric disorders, we'll first have to distinguish the different kinds of psychiatric disorders and then provide the explanations for those distinct kinds. And furthermore, if we want to control a system and really know where we can intervene into the system and make it work for us, knowing where the kinds are tells us which interventions will be appropriate and which interventions will not. And clearly, if the reason intended to talk about a prototype structure of kinds, that there are a cluster of properties, some of which are really quite central, some of which are a bit peripheral, and whether something is a member of that kind depends on whether it shares a number of a non-trivial number of the core features, though it might not have all of them. It might, and so they tend to recognize a sort of prototype structure. This picture, these are just pyramidal cells, and it's just up there to suggest, they're all pyramidal cells, but no two pyramidal cells are exactly alike. All right. Now, on the other end of the spectrum that we're trying to aim for the middle of is conventionalism. And conventionalism, which also, I guess, has gone under the name nominalism, is the claim that there's no objective distinctions between natural kinds and any other property cluster. That as Hacking says, that these are kinds that are constructed along lines of family resemblance, and that what puts things into a family is not nature, but people in concert. That it's our classificatory practices that divide things into these kinds, and that the world does not tell us which things belong in which kinds. And if that's the case, the idea that we're going to formulate a diagnostic and statistical manual that's going to be very useful for the treatment and diagnosis of psychiatric diseases looks dim, because whether two people have the same psychiatric disorder or not depends on who's looking at them, who is imposing their own taxonomy upon it. And so you get what Boyd calls promiscuity. As many kinds as there are possible perspectives that we might take on a given chunk of the world. And if that's the case, then the conventional kinds that we develop will only be useful for prediction, explanation, and control if we're tremendously lucky. In fact, there might not even be any sense to the idea that they would be good for prediction, explanation, and control. So neither of these are thought to be desirable options. Yeah, so for example, is indie music a kind? Or the other night at dinner we had this discussion, what is a taco? And which things count as tacos? Is it a taco if it has Korean barbecue and kimchi in it? Does it cease to be a taco? And the conventionalists would say, well, sure. There are things that people call tacos, and there's no objective fact of the matter about what a taco is, and so it's purely a matter of convention. And perhaps biology is just like tacos.
And psychiatry is just like tacos. It depends on who's looking at it and how they chunk the world into kinds. All right, so the homeostatic property cluster view is attempting to aim between these two. I won't be able to apply the homeostatic property cluster view to tacos, I don't think. But natural kinds, according to this view, B just is for Boyd, natural kinds are defined by these 4 features. He's got 10 or 12 or 15 features, but I've distilled them into what I think are the core center. The first one is that there's a cluster of properties, something that they share. Think about the prototype structure that I was just talking about. What makes something a dog? It's got fur and 4 legs, and it barks, and so you can list all of the properties of dogs, and that those things regularly occur together in the world. So all dogs seem to participate in this cluster of properties to varying degrees. The second thing, I'll walk through these in a little more detail in just a second. The second thing is that there's a mechanism that explains why those things co-occur with one another. In the case of dogs, mechanisms of genetic inheritance. And then he says that this property cluster that we're talking about, not only does the co-occurrence of these properties have to be explained by the underlying mechanism, but that cluster of properties has to be causally important. By which he means that the cluster figures in what he calls important causal generalizations. Right? And then the fourth thing that he mentions is, and this is going to do a lot of the work for me. I think it's just very hard to formulate this portion of the account clearly, is what he calls the maximal accommodation thesis, which is that any refinement of the definition of the kind either introduces causally or inductively irrelevant distinctions or glosses over causally and inductively relevant similarities. And in a way, my question can be, can we aim for the middle between these views? Can we accommodate the variability of biological phenomena that still have something that satisfies this accommodation constraint at the bottom? All right, so the cluster of properties I take to be already understood. But the second of these, the mechanism, Boyd is quite explicit here. He says the essential property, he probably shouldn't have used the word essential, but the essential property that makes particular instances members of the kind is their relationship to that causal mechanism that explains the co-occurrence of the properties in the cluster. And if you, in fact, have a set of properties that tend to co-occur because there exists a similarity-generating mechanism underneath, then that mechanism would ground the predictions that you would make about how the thing would behave under a wide variety of circumstances. Because there's this similarity-generating mechanism, you would expect all instances of the kind to participate in rough generalizations that would allow you to make predictions. And given that the mechanism underlies the co-occurrence of all of these phenomena, the mechanism would obviously explain why these phenomena co-occur with one another, and so it very naturally accommodates the notion of explanation. And given that the co-occurrence of the properties is underwritten by a piece of the causal structure of the world, and given that the way that we intervene on the world is by intervening into that causal structure, this view of natural kinds would naturally accommodate the idea that the reason we want kinds is to facilitate our ability to intervene in control systems. And in psychiatry, that's obviously a very important concern. And one could deny the idea that that there should be a mechanism underlying all of this, and that would just leave you with what I call a simple causal view of natural kinds, or just a simple causal view of the structure of the world. That is, you've got important causal generalizations, period. It need not be underwritten by a mechanism, or whether it is or not is irrelevant. It's just a question of whether you've got a cluster of properties that's somehow causally significant. And in the end, my view will come very close to that sort of thought, a simple causal view of natural kinds, if it's even a view of natural kinds anymore. But then you might wonder at that point what work the term natural kind is doing over and above just causally relevant variable, and perhaps we could simply dispense with this notion as an archaic remnant of an essentialist past. B3, the causal import of the cluster, the idea that the cluster figures in important causal generalizations. There there are two ways to read the idea of import here. The first one is to just say that it has to be a useful one, and that's a kind of pragmatism. I don't think Boyd would want to introduce that kind of notion into his account of natural kinds, because he really wants there to be a worldly basis for this. And if it turns out that our judgments about what's important and what's not important figure into the kind structure of the world, then it's not doing that role for us anymore. We're sliding in the direction of conventionalism. On the other hand, you might just give it an ontic reading. That word doesn't mean much. I just mean that we're now talking about the fact that it has effects of some sort. Right? If you deny that, then I think you're left with a simple metaphysical view of kinds, that there are kinds whenever there are similarity-generating mechanisms, even if they're not causally important. And part of what would be bad about that, I think, is that, barometer changes and storms and joint pain and complaints from grandmothers all seem to have a common underlying mechanism, and they tend to co-occur with one another because of barometric changes, and they're causally the effect of all of that. There's no causally significant effect of barometers, storms, and joint pains co-occurring with one another. And so if we don't include something like this, I think we're forced to say that there's a natural kind that corresponds to barometers, storms, joint pains, etc. And that seems much weaker than anything that would be helpful to us in reformulating the psychiatric diagnosis or taxonomizing the basic elements of cognition. So B3 is important. And then the fourth one, this, as I said, is the load-bearing part for this talk, that any refinement, I'll read it slowly, any refinement of the definition of the kind either introduces causally and inductively irrelevant distinctions or glosses over causally and inductively relevant similarities. So the kinds that we pick out should capture all of the causally and inductively relevant facts and not gloss over any causally relevant facts. So he says, for example, that the kind consists in that this consists in a certain accommodation between the relevant conceptual and classificatory practices and independently existing causal structures. The mechanisms that maintain any given HPC kind are part of the natural world, not simply our way of thinking about it or intervening in the world, and that's because it's underwritten by this mechanism. And he says it should neither gloss over causally relevant differences, so your taxonomy of kinds lumps together two things that really should be kept separate, then that's a sign that you need to revise your taxonomy of kinds. If, on the other hand, your taxonomy of kinds separates things that really belong together, that's a sign that you have to revise your taxonomy of kinds. And all of this is being guided by looking at the relevant causal structure of the situation, the mechanism that underlies the co-occurrence of these properties that underlie our ability to make causal and inductive distinctions of the sort that appear in this hard-to-read passage at the top. All right. I've already been using these terms, but I now want to talk about some strategies for implementing the normative constraint that kind should be accommodated to mechanisms. And the science that I'm most familiar with, honestly, is cognitive neuropsychology. And there, the goal is to infer how minds work by observing how they break. And so you often look for people who've had damage to a particular structure in the brain, and then you observe the behavioral differences, and you attempt to determine which cognitive functions are distinct from which other cognitive functions by determining which can be broken independently of the others. And so cognitive neuropsychology becomes a strategy. The methods of cognitive neuropsychology are strategies for lumping and splitting. The splitting strategy is a case where you have some mechanism, some phenomenon actually, like memory, and then you find out on the basis of your investigations that in fact that thing is multiple. That there isn't one kind of memory, there are many kinds of memory, say episodic and semantic, or declarative and procedural. And as I pointed out earlier, much of the work on the taxonomy of memories comes from patients who've lost completely one of these kinds of memory, but maintain the other kinds of memory, indicating that they must have distinct mechanisms. And given that they have distinct mechanisms, we're warranted as cognitive neuropsychologists in saying that these are two different elementary operations, declarative, semantic. Right? Paul Griffiths has this lovely book on what the emotions really are, in which he claims that there is no one kind of thing, emotions, that there are at least 3 different kinds of things that constitute the emotions. There are the basic affect programs, there are more social emotions, and what he calls cognitive emotions. Often you find people in the philosophy of psychiatry explaining that schizophrenia is a mess of a category. And perhaps part of the reason why we've had such difficulty treating the disorder well is that that there are significant subdivisions in the population that are currently diagnosed as schizophrenic that we have yet to recognize. And that if we understand the differences in the mechanisms that are going wrong in these different cases, then we would be able to tell that in fact there's not one thing, schizophrenia, but many different things. The alternative strategy is a lumping strategy. Oh, these terms, lumping and splitting, I got them from Victor McKusick in 1969, who was a genetic psychiatrist, and he wanted to introduce these terms for precisely this purpose. But this is a case where you have 2 distinct phenomena, or 2 or more distinct phenomena, and you recognize that really fundamentally they're the same thing. So burning, rusting, and breathing at some point in the history of science were considered to be entirely separate phenomena, but the advance of chemistry and Lavoisier and the chemical revolution suggests that in fact you've got one phenomenon underlying those three things. Sigmund Freud, I think, also believes that dreams and slips of the tongue and neurotic symptoms all come down to a basic kind of cognitive mechanism that explains all of them, and so they're unified in that way. AIDS is another good example where you've got lots of different symptoms that can appear in somebody who has AIDS, but then you recognize that in fact they're all explained by a collapse of the immune system brought on by HIV infection, and then you recognize that even though these individual patients look very different from one another, what lumps them into a single category is that they all have the same mechanism going on inside of them, but the symptoms can vary in different ways. Maybe I won't discuss the Pascal, well, I will. Pascal Boyer has the provocative hypothesis that religious rituals and obsessive-compulsive disorder share an underlying common mechanism, in which case religious ritual and obsessive-compulsive disorder are not 2 different things, but one and the same thing. All right. If this is the way that the inference works, that we find that when we find distinct mechanisms, we split. When we find that they're really underwritten by the same mechanism, we lump. We then have to address the question, when do we have 2 mechanisms and when do we have 1 mechanism? Or when are 2 mechanisms of distinct kinds and when are 2 mechanisms of exactly the same kind? Right? And as I said, I was very excited when I first read this view, because I thought, here's a way that I can connect with this large literature in the philosophy of science. And we had developed an account of what mechanisms are. Many of you are familiar with this diagram, I know from having talked with you, but this is a phenomenon that is explained by the mechanism. You can consider it something like the behavior as a mechanism as a whole. And then these lines here suggest that we're now looking within. And when we look within, what we recognize is a bunch of parts, entities, and they causally interact with one another. Those are the activities, and that they're organized together spatially, temporally, hierarchically, actively, several kinds of organization, in such a way that they produce this phenomenon. All right, so you might think this is a match made in heaven. Boyd has a view of natural kinds that requires a notion of mechanism. We have a notion of mechanism. Let's move it over and see whether it can do what Boyd needs it to do. That's the idea. But then you start thinking about it, and you recognize that it gets fairly complicated. First, this is another proponent of the homeostatic property cluster view, Frank Kyle. And Frank Kyle has this lovely diagram where he illustrates the different kinds of mechanisms that might underlie the co-occurrence of the properties in the property cluster. In one case, all of the properties in the property cluster causally interact, say, in a loop, so that they're all causes of one another. In another case, there might be an underlying mechanism. That's the case that I'm more usually interested in. And it explains that the occurrence of that underlying mechanism explains why all of these different properties occur, or causes all of these different properties to occur. Kyle also recognizes a case where you've got multiple different causes, but they all converge on a single effect, and he thinks that that's a case where you would want to lump these properties into a single kind. Or I'm not sure exactly how this is different from that. It's just not a cycle. But this is another case where all the properties are causally interacting in somewhat nefarious ways. And I'm not entirely sure how this one is distinct from this one. But you get the general idea. There are many kinds of mechanisms. This is an action potential. If there are kinds in neuroscience, this had better be one of them. All right? It's a basic thing that neurons do. It's part of the fundamental ontology of neuroscience. It's how neurons communicate information, to the best of our knowledge at the moment, at least. All right. Now, suppose that we want to ask, is this a single kind? This thing is situated in the causal structure of the world in a number of different ways. And if we're going to appeal to a mechanism to explain why it has the features that it does, we have to ask the question, which mechanism are we talking about? Now, the natural one for me to think about in this context is the membrane mechanism. That's the sort of thing that Hodgkin and Huxley were particularly interested in describing. They would explain the occurrence of this action potential in terms of the underlying neural facts about the membrane, that it contains sodium and potassium channels, and that the cytoplasm and the extracellular space have sodium and potassium in them, and etc. But we might also say, oh no, this action potential is in fact, and that would be an example of something like this. But we might also say, no, what explains this action potential is that I stimulated the cell back here. And now I'm hooking it into a mechanism not by looking within it, but by looking behind it, into the antecedent causes that produce the action potential. And that would be a case that looks something like A or perhaps D. Or I might ask the question, how is it that neurons, over the course of the life of an organism, manage to maintain the ability to produce these sorts of things? And then I'm going to have to talk about some genetics, and the fact that there are genes for sodium and potassium channels, and I'm going to talk about how those genes are regulated and how they're cycled through the membrane and that sort of thing. Or I might be interested in the developmental causes. How do I grow neurons in the first place? Or I might be interested in, how is it that in the history of life, organisms came to have cells that generated action potentials that look something like this? And the point that I want to drive home is that given this diversity of mechanisms, one might be led to lump on the basis of one kind of mechanism and split on the basis of appeal to others. And then the question arises, if we want to regiment our taxonomy of natural kinds by looking at mechanisms, which mechanisms should we be looking at? And if we get very permissive about the kinds of mechanistic structures that we can appeal to, then for any given phenomenon, we're going to be able to situate it in the causal structure of the world in innumerable ways, and those might lead us to lump or split, depending on how we pay attention. Let me give you some examples. Sometimes these things will coincide, and maybe what's really interesting about action potentials is that all of those mechanisms, in fact, point to one thing, right? But sometimes they don't. So consider cases where you've got many different etiological, antecedent causal mechanisms, but one constitutive mechanism. So, for instance, HIV infection, I assume, is a single thing underwritten by a single constitutive mechanism, but one might end up HIV infected through sexual activity or a blood transfusion or the use of a dirty needle, or and we could list many ways that one could be HIV infected. Or take clinical depression, perhaps, as a better case. Let's assume for the moment that there's one underlying mechanism that underwrites a class of clinical depression. That might be caused by the death of a pet, the death of a loved one, the loss of a job, angst about the world situation, the Trump presidency. Any number of causes might ultimately lead to exactly one aberration in the same underlying mechanism. So if we attend to the etiology, we'll split. There will be Trump depression and mortality-based depression. If we look at the underlying mechanism, as I'm assuming that there is one, we would be told to lump these things rather than split them. Or we might have a case where we have one etiological mechanism and different constitutive mechanisms. So AIDS, as I mentioned before, in every case there's a case of HIV infection, but the way that disease manifests itself in any given patient is going to be different because they collapse their immune system, but then all hell breaks loose and they can get all sorts of opportunistic infections and different kinds of cancers that they wouldn't get otherwise. And I'm told that tertiary syphilis is like this as well. All instances of tertiary syphilis involve becoming infected, but it can manifest itself in entirely different ways in people once it becomes active. So there's a case where there's a single etiological mechanism which would tell you to lump, but many different constitutive mechanisms that would tell you to split. So the world seems to be telling us to do two things at the same time that are incompatible with one another. And then it might be the case that there are one and many etiological mechanisms at different stages. So it might be that needles and sex and transfusion can cause HIV, which then produces AIDS, which manifests in many different ways. And so depending on where in the causal structure of the situation we focus, we'll be led to lump or to split. But that simply depends on where we're looking, not on the structure of the world. The structure of the world, again, seems to pull us in both directions, depending on where we happen to be looking. In the psychiatric cases that I worked on with Ken Kendler, there might one interesting case is where you might have people that have very different disorders from the point of view of DSM, but they all benefit from similar treatment plans. That is, that they all go to the same group. That group therapy will work for all of these people. And in that sense, it participates in causal generalizations that allow you to make predictions about outcomes and treatments and all of that, even though from a constitutive or etiological perspective, they split. So this is a case where it's not so much the causes or the constituents, but the effects and the controllability of it. So if you buy this idea that we ought to regiment our taxonomy of kinds by looking to the causal structure of the world and that it will do this work for us, this strong accommodation thesis demands that there should be no further revision on the basis of the causal structure of the world. But in each of these cases, depending on where we look, we're going to be forced to revise. And so the world doesn't tell us. We have to make a decision about where the important place to look is. All right. One thing that you could do in this instance, and maybe this works in some cases, maybe in psychiatry we're not so concerned with the evolutionary past. We're really concerned with the constitutive mechanisms, or we're concerned with the developmental mechanisms. The point for a philosopher, though, is that nothing in nature tells you that this mechanism is more important than that mechanism, for taxonomizing the kinds. A second possibility is that you could just go pluralist here, which is actually my inclination, and to say that what counts as maximally refined sort of depends on your focus. It might be that, when you find that certain etiological pathways come together at some point, that you want to lump them because that's the area where you can control the situation. And in that case, your focus is on controlling it, and you would treat them all as one. However, if what you want to do is provide palliative treatment of the different symptoms, then the differences in symptoms would matter. And then in those circumstances, you would want to split. And you might say, in all of those cases, it's still somehow grounded in the causal structure of the world. This should have disappeared. But what I want to point out is that if we go pluralist here, we've at least allowed some intrusion of perspective into this view. And I only move this a little bit to the left, because we have to first decide which mechanism we are going to look at. And which mechanism we choose to privilege will depend a bit on our perspective. And the world is not telling us which mechanism we have to pay attention to. Things get worse, though. We're not interested in individual mechanisms here. We're interested in types of mechanisms. So schizophrenia is underwritten by a type of mechanism, would be the thought, or depression is underwritten by a type of mechanism. So the HPC view depends on having a notion of what a kind of mechanism is. If you allow every individual mechanism that differs in any of the ways that they might differ from one another to count as a distinct mechanism, that is, if it has a slightly different entity or a slightly different spatial organization or a slightly different, then there are going to be as many natural kinds as there are individuals. So this, for example, is a picture of the hippocampus drawn by Santiago Ramon y Cajal. And it's a lovely drawing of a hippocampus, but it's a lovely drawing of one slice of one hippocampus. And no other hippocampus in the history, I don't know that this is true, but I'll assert it, if any, very few other hippocampuses in the world have had precisely the structure of this hippocampus. So if we get very technical about when two mechanisms are distinct, and we include all of the fine detail in those mechanisms, then every mechanism in the world will be a kind to itself. We need something that smooths over those differences and puts things that are superficially similar, although in detail really quite different, into the same category. The HPC view depends on a notion of kinds of mechanism on pains of there being too many natural kinds. But any detectable difference is a causal difference. That is, if there's just a slight difference in the location of a cell in the hippocampus, then there is some intervention that will affect this hippocampus but won't affect others. And that's a causal generalization. Whether it's important or not, I don't know. So one natural thought would be to say, well, we're only going to pay attention to the slight individual differences here if they make a difference to the behavior of the whole thing. That would be a natural... So maybe it's not that important, these little tiny differences. But notice that what just happened, when we make that move, we flip the order of determination here. We were supposed to appeal to the causal structure of the world to tell us what the kinds were, but now when we go to look at the causal structure of the world, when we want to know whether two mechanisms are mechanisms of the same kind, we now have to go back and appeal to the property cluster that we were hoping to ground as a natural kind in the first place. Another way of putting this is that the view regresses. You want to know when is this property cluster a natural kind? When it's underwritten by the same kind of mechanism. All right, when are two mechanisms of the same kind? When they share their kinds of entities, activities, and organizational features. All right, when are two entities of the same kind? And now we're simply repeating the question that we started with. So in turning to the world and expecting it to tell us when the properties should be clustered together, in fact, we have to first make a decision about when two mechanisms should be clustered together. So that's bad. That's in philosophy, that's really bad when that happens, right? But I also think there's a scientific problem here. This idea of homeostatic property cluster kinds tolerates variability and multiple realizability in mechanisms. That's why this view was invented, to handle the fact that not all dogs are exactly the same. But if the mechanism is in fact different in some way, then they have to be different in their effects in some way. Even if it's just a minor difference in spatial organization, or a minor difference in where the cells are located or how they interact with one another, that's a causally detectable difference. So if that's the case, if you follow this accommodation constraint, then the HPC kinds must be accommodated to the causal structure of the world. And the problem is, if you characterize it too abstractly, if you characterize the mechanism too abstractly, then you will gloss over causally significant differences. And if you characterize them in maximal detail, then every mechanism is a kind to itself. So then we have to ask the question, what is the appropriate degree of abstraction for forming this kind of taxonomic revision? And in the absence of an answer to that question, we don't really have a view of natural kinds at all. So for example, I just showed you the Ramon y Cajal drawing of a single hippocampus. Here's the kind of drawing that you would find in a standard neuroscience textbook. It displays the hippocampus is made up of these pyramidal cells and these granule cells and this input from the entorhinal cortex, and it shows the characteristic 3-synaptic loop. You might say, well, anything that shares roughly this structure counts as a hippocampus. Or you might go read O'Keefe and Nadel and Nadel's computational models of the hippocampus, and here you get a structure that looks like that, and you say, well, that's what a hippocampus is right there. It's something that performs these different computational functions. Or we could say, oh no, the hippocampus is a sequential Hopfield net. Or maybe the hippocampus is a feedback mechanism. Or maybe it's a control mechanism of some sort. And what I'm doing here is just describing one and the same thing at different grains. And when we describe it at those different grains, as it becomes more abstract, more individuals get lumped in. As it gets concrete, we divide more. And then the question is, when are we describing it at the appropriate, at what grain is it appropriate to base our taxonomic revision? That's the problem. So the point is that two mechanisms count as the same kind of mechanism according to one schema, and to different kinds of mechanisms according to another, depending on whether you're looking at the Ramon y Cajal picture, the standard hippocampus, or the computational hippocampus, or treating it just as a control system of some sort. And in science, we have to balance generalization with the need to recognize causally significant differences. But such balancing is just the sort of thing that depends on what we're trying to do. If I'm Nadel and I want to model the hippocampus, I don't need that Cajal diagram. It's too detailed for my purposes. If I'm trying to teach an introductory course, then the trisynaptic loop hippocampus is the right one to use, and the computational hippocampus is the wrong one to use. But now it just seems like this kind of balancing act brings us into the picture again. And when we wanted the world to tell us what the kinds were, we're now deciding which parts of the world will tell us what the kinds are. And that's an intrusion of perspective. The second thing that one might say here is that we could go promiscuous and just accept all useful characterizations of the mechanisms. So there is the feedback kind, there is the computational kind, there is the trisynaptic loop kind, there are the individual ones, and that's fine. But notice that this now reverses the direction of fit, that we are going to accept the mechanism schema when we find it useful for our purposes. And then you might just wonder, what is this mechanism business supposed to do for us in the first place? It's not doing any work. How am I doing on time, Miguel?
You have 10 more minutes, 9 more minutes.
Great. Great. So to summarize, the homeostatic property cluster view needs a notion of a kind of mechanism. And so when we have kinds, when they have the same kind of mechanism, and so you got a problem. The HPC view needs to define an appropriate degree of abstraction in characterizing kinds of mechanisms, but appropriate degree of abstraction depends on what we intend to do with our description, and what we intend to do with our description is a fact about how humans find it useful to cluster properties, and the correct taxonomy of kind depends on what we intend to do with it. So again, we're sliding this box closer to the conventionalist side, like that. And again, that should disappear. It should be over there. But we're not all the way to conventionalism, because after all, the causal structure of the world is still doing work for it, but we're doing a lot of work too. All right, here's the third problem, boundaries of mechanisms. So when does one mechanism start and another mechanism end? Go back to this action potential here. Which are the entities and activities and organizational features that are part of the action potential mechanism? Now, it was an interesting feature of Cartesian mechanism that when you drop teleology out of the world, that nothing can get carved into parts anymore, because there's no basis for chunking the world into different things. And I worry that we're still facing that kind of problem here. What objective feature of the causal structure of the world binds the entities, activities, and organizational features into a mechanism in the first place? Where does one mechanism begin and another ends? So think about many things that people have tried to do to individuate mechanisms. One thing that you might say is, well, some mechanisms are compartmentalized. So transcription in the nucleus, translation in the cytoplasm, right? Or you might say it's, but of course, many mechanisms are not compartmentalized in that way. The action potential famously is on both sides of the cell. You might say contact action, that the things have to actually be in contact with one another. But many biological mechanisms don't have that kind of contact action in them. If you talk about de-repression mechanisms, for example, there are going to be non-occurrences that are part of the mechanism. Some have considered the idea that they all move together. I'm not sure what that means. Or that they're stable across spatial translation, that you can pick them up and move them from one place to another and they maintain their integrity. But of course, that's not going to be the case for most complicated cytochemical mechanisms. You might try to do it on the basis of things like the strength of their interaction with one another or their bandwidth of interaction. I discussed a few of these yesterday in my talk on networks when I was talking about clustering algorithms. My worry is that these notions of strength and bandwidth ultimately also depend on human perspective. It seems that what puts things together into a mechanism is their relevance to some phenomenon that we care about. What makes something in the mechanism or something out of the mechanism is whether it makes a difference to the phenomenon we're trying to explain. But notice that again reverses the direction of fit. We wanted the mechanisms to tell us where the kinds of property clusters are, but now when we say, when are these things all in the same mechanism? It's when they're all relevant to this phenomenon. And so now we're not helping ourselves, we're just chasing our tail. Here's another way of putting the point. Stuart Glennon, talking about mechanisms, say that all mechanisms are mechanisms of or for something. And how one characterizes the phenomenon will determine what goes into the mechanism and what's not in the mechanism. Mechanisms are clustered into kinds because of the property clusters that they explain. So what objectivity is added by appeal to mechanisms over just a simple property cluster view? That's the question. And now I'm worried that we've slid really far in the direction of conventionalism in some way. So, with the few minutes remaining, maybe I'll skip this business about... I have to say this. So, many of you in the room know that I embrace an ontic conception of scientific explanation. And it's grounded in the idea of mechanisms. And now I've told you that the idea of mechanism seems to be shot through with human perspective. And you might think it's just impossible to have the ontic conception and the idea that mechanisms are shot through with human perspective. And that's what I want to address now. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's really a problem for me. Mechanistic explanation, I think, is ultimately still grounded in the causal structure of the world. I don't think that that's an especially pragmatically laden notion. Secondly, that all explanations are relative to the choice of the explanandum phenomenon. That's true. It's what we're interested in explaining. But from there, whether a factor is relevant to that is a matter of empirical test. And we can do studies and objectively determine whether that's true or not. And whether we should lump or split depends on our interests and needs. That's true, but it's an objective fact whether the difference in mechanisms makes a difference to our investigative and instrumental objectives. That is it the case that these different etiologies make a difference to how I treat this case of depression? And if the answer to that's an empirically addressable question. If the etiology doesn't make a difference, then it's not one that you should use for your instrumental purposes. So there is an intrusion of perspective into this picture in our definition of mechanisms, but there is a causal structure underlying all of this that I think is objective and objectively accessible. I think this is really similar to something that Nancy Cartwright has said when she talks about the world being dappled. And I would rather put it this way, that science is dappled. That we come at the world with different perspectives and different kinds of models, and that can lead us to the opinion that in fact the world doesn't all fit together. But unlike and so that depending on how we come at the world, we're going to carve it into different mechanisms depending on our perspectives. But unlike Cartwright, I don't think that the world is in fact dappled. She sometimes goes so far as to say that the world is logically incoherent, but nothing that I've said suggests as much. All right, with a couple of minutes remaining, 2 minutes remaining, let me just say something about where I wanted to end today. So if you're with me so far, that we can at least talk about whether something causes something else in a way that's free of this intrusion of human perspective. If you grant me that, then I think that we might actually think about what we're doing in a slightly different way. Maybe I don't have enough time to make this clear, but I'll try. In philosophy of science, although many people have tried to break from this idea, we often talk about the goal of science as somehow building models that reflect the structure of the world as it is independently of us. One might also approach science thinking more like an engineer. What are the materials that the world gives me that I can combine to do new things? And these two ways of looking at a problem are entirely different from one another. And I think somebody in the medical profession or in the psychiatry profession maybe ought to think more like an engineer and less like somebody who wants to mirror the structure of the world. This is Francis Bacon. And he's an idol of mine, and he's an idol of mine in part because he wrote this thing called the New Atlantis, which is a utopia in which people use their tremendous scientific knowledge to make all kinds of things. There's a giant chicken in here somewhere, and telephones, and that sort of stuff. Right. Let me give you an example, recent developments of optogenetics, where we can take viruses and use them to deliver light-sensitive channels into cells in the brain, and then we can use a fiber optic cable to turn on those channels and make the cells active pretty much under our control. And in a recent paper, not so recent anymore, Tsai et al. Describe an experiment in which the details here don't matter so much, in which they're able to induce place conditioning in a rat with optogenetic stimulation. So they can take a rat and let it run around in a box, and if they deliver a stimulus to it when it's on one side of the box, it will develop a place aversion to that side of the box. That's roughly what's going on here. And then they conclude, phasic stimulation of dopaminergic neurons suffice to establish place preference in the absence of other rewards. These results establish a causal role in behavioral conditioning for defined spiking models in a specific cell type. Now, I do agree that the experiment shows that it sufficed to establish place preference. I do not agree that this experiment by itself shows that this has a causal role in the conditioning of the rat. Why? And this is, I think, a kind of maker's knowledge as opposed to mirroring knowledge. If it's the case that we can control the behavior of this rat or this mouse and make it do what we want it to by interfering with its brain, does that show that we really know how the system works? And I think that the answer is no. And it's because there's a gap between maker's knowledge and modeler's knowledge, or maker's knowledge and this mirroring knowledge. The ability to arbitrarily produce a change in Y by stimulating variable X shows that changes in X are sufficient to bring about changes in Y, as they said in the first part of that quote before. But the ability to arbitrarily produce a change in Y by stimulating variable X does not show that X plays a physiological causal role in bringing about Y. Why not? Well, you might have, through your stimulation, used some kind of artificial route that produced the conditioning in this case. Right? So stimulation can unmask a physiologically irrelevant way of conditioning behavior. Right? There are many physiologically irrelevant causal regularities in the brain. Think of the brain not as an organization of causal mechanisms working as they do, but think of it as a sea of possibilities, of causal relationships that might be harnessed for the purposes of doing something with them. For modelers, for people who are interested in modeling the brain or modeling psychiatric disorders, they want to characterize it as it works on its own, independently of us. But an engineer doesn't approach a system like that. An engineer approaches the system as a bunch of parts that might be made to do things. A good example of this is neuroprosthetics, where people are able to drive robotic arms through electrophysiological records taken from their skulls. And in those cases, one thing that's very interesting is that you do not have to plug these electrodes into motor cortex to control the arm. You can plug this into auditory cortex, and people will learn to use auditory cortex to control the robotic arm. Auditory cortex in its normal functioning is auditory cortex. It's for hearing. But it contains nascent within it a set of possibilities for exploitation that can be used to do things like drive robotic arms. So the point is that the set of, if we go looking for natural kinds, the ways that things are naturally chunked in the brain, the set of causal regularities that might be exploited for this kind of engineering or making is much greater than the set of physiologically relevant causal generalizations by which the brain normally or typically works. The natural kinds of biological mechanisms are less relevant to the engineer than they are to the physiological biologist. The set of natural kinds is very narrow or blinkered in our perspective compared to the sea of possible causal interactions that one could either find in the brain or engineer to occur within the brain. All right, so to conclude, lumping and splitting are really important strategies for accommodating kinds to the mechanistic structure of the world. And this all sounds like it's going to work really well, but as a philosophical thesis, the HPC view runs into several kinds of regress problems. There's the problem of saying which mechanism matters for the purposes of taxonomizing kind. There's the problem of choosing the appropriate level of abstraction, and the challenge of defining the boundaries of types of mechanisms. This is only a problem, I think, if you think there have to be natural kinds, and if you think that's what science is really about. But what I'm trying to suggest here at the end is that perhaps for these sciences like psychiatry, where these taxonomies really are important to us, what matters is less the natural kinds that we find independent of our perspective, but rather the set of causal generalization that the brain affords to us that might be exploited for the purposes of curing these kinds of terrible psychiatric disorders. That's it. Thanks.
Some questions? Start with Paul.
Thank you very much for your talk. So the first question would be, why not just giving up talking in terms of mechanisms if in psychiatry and cognitive neuroscience we could be instead focusing on idiosyncratic and cognitive assemblies or composition of the mind in the first place. So why not getting rid of mechanicism in psychiatry and starting focusing on idiosyncratic mind composition in different subjects? I mean, just giving up searching for underlying general causes for psychiatry. I mean, perhaps the common or the mainstream notion of mechanicisms has been so harmful for trying to understand psychiatric disorders. And if we agree that there are no natural kinds, that partition of functions are arbitrary, that dissociation or dissociation doesn't work, but why not just starting the other way around?
I don't think there's any doing psychiatry without thinking about causation. At the individual level or at the, and I don't think, if I don't want the lesson here to be that psychiatrists should stop looking for mechanisms. The main point here is just that the taxonomy of kinds, that it's not clear how the taxonomy of kinds can be regimented. It's not clear that the causal structure of the world will do the difficult work of deciding what the fundamental ontology of psychiatry should be for us. And I still think that certainly knowing how things causally interact and how they're organized is a really crucial piece of figuring out where you can intervene to solve a problem. And even if you're dealing with individual cases, even if you have the view that people whose minds start to fail all fail in different and individually idiosyncratic ways, it's still the case that in those individuals, part of what we have to do is figure out how we can cause them to work in different ways and what the effective strategies for intervening are. So I don't think it's going to be possible to jettison the idea of cause. And once you've got the idea of cause, a mechanism is merely an assemblage of causes. organized together. And so although I'm a perspectivalist about where one mechanism ends and another mechanism begins, and when you've got two mechanisms of the same type, I think we just cannot jettison the idea of causation if what we want to do is intervene to help people.
But would you agree in getting rid of the search of general causes for every subject, right?
Well, I was just saying that nothing that I said. I mean, we could decide to do something individualistic. My thought was that even when we go, if I'm understanding your question correctly, when we go individualistic, we can't. That doesn't mean that we should abandon focusing on causes and effects.
The Voigt's homeostatic property cluster thesis is very compatible with mechanicism, but why not focusing on scientific kinds or any other account for kinds or scientific classifications?
Wait, I'm sorry, I didn't. What was the question?
That mechanicism is very compatible with Voigt's perspective on causality searches, but why not focusing on other types of descriptions, as in scientific kinds or successful kinds?
I'm not sure what the contrast is. We could go essentialist, or we can go. There would have to be another way of thinking about kinds that weren't among the available options that I addressed here. And maybe there is such a thing. I mean, we could talk about what the difference is.
Without committing with causality, but I'm thinking about an example with aspirin. When aspirin was discovered to be that successful.
For example, the essence of gold or water. You don't see a causal structure there. Water, just a molecular composition of gold and some composition. We're talking about natural kinds and essence, but you don't see a causal mechanism.
Oh, I see. So that there might be some other notion. I mean, when we get into that area, something like water or the basic elements, there I think I have to really just claim ignorance about what the kind structure of those sciences really is. My inclination is to say that essentialism sounds better there than it does in the human sciences or the biological sciences. And my intuition in that direction is just that you don't find the kind of variability in the elements that you do elsewhere. But I'm sure that there's a chemist somewhere who would be very upset with that kind of statement, and they would explain to me that in fact the basic elements do come in distinct kinds, and that I'm wrong about this. But
I really get your exposition. I agree with almost all. And I have a certain kind of doubt about. I think that your position is quite near to conventionalism in a way that also I don't know if you know, but it's in your acknowledged Wilson position about conventionalism is very similar like yours, but yours is a deflationary position about the concept of natural kind. No? My question is why or how is which is the difference about accept a normal conventionalism and or accept a deflationary position? It's just like a moral or a semantic difference between say, well, I think that there are no natural kinds, and say, well, natural kinds are whatever we want to.
well, I kept sliding that bar over and thinking, oh, I'm moving towards a kind of conventionalism, and at that point I wonder, why am I even talking about natural kinds at all? Why am I giving an account of natural kinds? And I want to be very cautious about all of this. I think psychiatry is one of the most important sciences. And I would very much like to say things that are helpful to psychiatrists about how they should go about carving up the causal structure of the world. And I'm very timid about saying Mechanisms will not answer this question for you. Because at the same time, as this paper that I wrote with Kendler suggests, if I had to tell a psychiatrist how should you proceed, I would say look for cases where the mechanisms come apart and draw distinctions there. But I think that the main lesson here, and what keeps me from being a complete conventionalist, is that I'm a causal realist. And so I just want to abandon, maybe this word natural kind comes with too many associations. And that when we're dealing with schizophrenia, it might well be that in some sense, large groups of schizophrenics belong in the same category, but that for other purposes, it would be better to subdivide them. Maybe for pharmacology, we subdivide them. Maybe for group therapy, we lump them together. Maybe for etiology, we lump. Maybe for etiology, we split. And that we ought to be open to a kind of flexibility that depending on what it is that we want to accomplish, we will be led to lump and split in different ways. And that maybe the idea of trying to jettison the idea of a natural kind is to liberate our minds so that we are no longer inclined to think that schizophrenia must be one thing or it must be many things, when it could in fact be one thing and many things at the same time. And that what makes it one or many depends on what we're trying to do or where we're focusing in the causal structure of the world. And so I think I would rather, to me, the term natural kind comes with, the sense that as it were, God wrote into the structure of the world that these things shall be cows, and these things shall be pigeons, and these things shall be, and I think that we need to get rid of that way of thinking, and to think maybe more like Nancy Cartwright is encouraging us to think, that the kind structure of the world, if we want to persist in talking that way, is dappled and overlapping, and that the most useful way to approach all of this is not to assume that either schizophrenia is one thing or many, but rather to recognize that it could be one thing and many at the same time, and that's okay. And some of the problems that I'm talking about here, the solution is just to say, well, it's one thing etiologically, it's a separate thing constitutively, it's one thing if you consider it abstractly, it's many things if you consider it concretely, and then the question is which of those perspectives are relevant to the project that you've got. If you're trying to teach an undergraduate class, schizophrenia is one thing, right? If you're trying to treat a patient, schizophrenia is many things. If you're trying to assign drugs, maybe you get the idea, maybe. And so I guess just what I want to do is pound the table and say, natural kinds. Yeah.
Well, I think you have already answered this question. I want to be somewhat apologetic for natural kinds. Going back to your first slide, you put the periodic table. So, probably being naive, the chemical elements look like natural elements. But we could go farther back, and we have particles, elementary particles. So particle physicists will say your protons, muons, mesons, and electrons seem to be clusters of properties, each of them, and they are very good candidates to be natural kinds. As far as I know, particle physicists only talk about a small number of different particles. I think about 20 or something.
Yeah.
So that's evidence in favor of essentialism, at least in the physical and chemical sciences.
Right.
But for some essentialism.
Right. I don't think I was especially clear. So when I said natural kinds, I should have said natural kinds in the special sciences. And it might well be that in physics and chemistry we find something that this language of natural kinds really gets a grip. But that when we get to more complex systems that are made out of those, we find increasing variability. We still want to be able to type things, but the variability in them prevents us from having such a rigorous notion of natural kinds. So really everything that I said today is about neuroscience, biology, physiology, but I don't know enough about physics and chemistry. I just have to punt to people who know it better, and they can tell me whether there is an essentialist notion of kinds that remains there. I'm willing to accept that there very well might be. And in that case, my dismissive attitude about all of this is mistaken. But I still want to maintain the dismissive attitude about it with respect to what are often called the special sciences, like biology and neuroscience.
Hi.
Hey.
Thanks for the talk. I have two questions. I think one is related to what you just answered, and the answer might be exactly the same as it is because if the view of mechanism, if the mechanistic view works, I would think that the way the mechanism is found, the identification of entities would be a way to identify natural types. I mean, if there is an objective means of getting at constitutive entities of mechanisms that do the things that we observe in the world, then those constitutive entities would have to belong to kinds, or would be at least candidates to be classified or generalized. So, I don't know, proteins could be channels or membranes. Would your answer be the same as before?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that when we get to the entities in like neuroscience, hippocampus, mammillary bodies, pyramidal cell, even at the cellular level, or even sodium channel, we're dealing with something that's variable, and that variability will, although we definitely type these things, there's a question of how different two sodium channels can be before they're really distinct types of sodium channels, and how many kinds of dopamine receptors do we have now? I've lost count. And so, one might want to rely on the entities, but then we have to have some way of talking about kinds of entities, and in the special sciences, it might be that we eventually get down to quarks, or brains, or strings, and then we've hit the kind structure, but that won't help us to identify the entities such as hippocampuses and cells and dopamine receptors.
Okay.
That was a question?
My other question was that you distinguished between more engineering kind of focus on what's going on and intervening in the rat and mirror kind of approaches, as in, like, I guess mirroring the mechanism. Would this be like the distinction, a vice versa distinction between abstract direct representation and other types of representation in science? Or what do you mean by mirror?
Yeah, I chose that word this afternoon. What I have in mind, often in the philosophy of biology, people focus quite a lot on things like teleology, and that's an important part of telling what the parts are and what they do, and how to individuate parts, and so the people who claim, for example, that Swamp Man, forgive me, but I assume many people in this world know the Swamp Man example, and they would say Swamp Man doesn't have arms or kidneys, or because Swamp Man is not part of the right sort of historical tradition to be carvable in these ways. Michael Thompson, I think, says some things of exactly that sort, so where was I going with that thought? I got stuck on Swamp Man. What was that?
The mirroring.
Oh, mirroring, yeah. Oh, so then there's this assumption that there's a structure to the organism that's there waiting for us to find it, and the goal of science is to describe it as it is. And there's a proper function. I don't mean proper function Millikan. I just mean that there's a thing that the heart is supposed to do, and there's a thing that the kidney is supposed to do, and a thing that the liver is supposed to do, and that we carve organisms up on the basis of that kind of consideration. And there, the job of the biologist is to get it right, to describe the world as it really is, to describe the action potential as it is in itself, right? And then the contrast class that I'm looking for here is more of the engineering perspective. I want to know what do I have to work with here and what can I make it do? And the goal of describing how it works as it works is less important than figuring out how can I make it do the various things that I'd like it to do. And whether I'm intervening on parts that are defined as such through our teleological historical perspective, or whether I'm doing it in order to find an effective cure for something, or in order to attach a robotic arm. It'll change. I don't have to respect the kind. I don't have to respect the. I don't have to have the idea that there's a structure to this thing independently of what I want to do with it that comes prepackaged in this biological organism, but rather to see the organism as a what did I say? Like an ocean of potential causal interactions that may have never been used in the history of the organism or in the development of the organism, or not used now. But if I just inject a little something, then suddenly these two things are connected and working together. And that maybe we should think about biology. Many people do think about biology in these terms, but thinking about it less in terms of trying to mirror the structure, the teleological structure that's there for us to discover, and rather thinking about what are the causal possibilities within this thing. And that's the contrast that I'm looking for between the mirroring and the making. Yeah, thanks.
I'm going to use my opportunity as a moderator to ask you a question. So the first one would be how can we, the first one would be whether we can distinguish, taxonomize the different spatial sciences without natural kinds. So would it be a different subject matter or just a difference in the kind of questions that they ask? So are they investigating different things or just asking different? So is the distinction just a matter of the kind of questions? Because the kind of questions what is going to individuate the mechanism. And the second one.
Can I answer that just so that I don't lose track of what's going on? I think of disciplines and fields as sociologically determined entities. I mean, even in the course of my lifetime, we went, I started in a department that was called behavioral neuroscience, then it became neuroscience, then it became cognitive neuroscience. It was all in the same building with the same people. But it changed its name to just sort of keep up with the times. And so I don't think of fields as having some sort of sacrosanct unity to them, but they are partly defined, of course, by the questions that we ask. And
fair enough. So the second, I want to get clear about how the picture, the ontic picture that you show. So there would be some kind of entities, whatever they are, and then causal relations, full stop. And then, that's what there is in the world. And whether we pick some causal relations for some reasons or other has to do with our own interest. So they're just those causes. So, and that's fine. Then something that you have shown is that, look, with the homeostatic property cluster as an attempt to define or to get an understanding of natural kind, we're going nowhere. And somebody would say, fine, but that's enough natural kinds. Why? Because sometimes natural kinds are ways in which we put discussion. So some people would say, no, I mean, that's fine. So there is this, but nonetheless, some of the causal, even if I share with you the ontic picture, some of the causal structure are touched by nature. And I don't know, I would need a theory to define why ones and no others are, but I just assume that and put in those terms a debate. That's something that is often used. So just to take an example, so in cognitive philosophy, cognitive science, I don't know how interesting that might be, that's irrelevant, but trying to distinguish cognition from perception. And the way in which this is presented, like, are they or are they not two different natural kinds? And this, I seem to have an idea of what they want to say. And of course they would need a notion of natural kind, but you cannot do everything in philosophy. You just assume that some of these, and I just want you to share your thoughts with.
I don't know really anything about that debate, but that debate in
irrelevant. The
particular.
debate itself is irrelevant. It's just what
Yeah. But my inclination is to say that the real issue there is perhaps hidden rather than illuminated by framing it in terms of natural kinds. That maybe if we dropped the natural kind language and had to look for a more perspicuous formulation of what the question is, what's at stake in asking whether these are different from one another, or what role perception, how much cognition plays a role in perception, and that maybe there's a better way to ask that question in this case. I don't want to do away with talking about. I don't want to do away with grouping things. That would be ridiculous. Obviously, to communicate with one another, we have to group things, and I wanted to point out that this isn't. I don't think this just collapses into a kind of conventionalism. There are incorrect ways of grouping things. I think, and objectively, on the basis of the causal structure of things.
But insofar as we respect, insofar as we are getting the causal structure, so we're not getting the causal structure. Any possible selection of causal relation could be called phenomenon. So there is no. So and I wanted to contrast this. So somebody can think, no, we cannot do. Probably you're right. So I'm not going to press it. But the idea would be, I don't need to give a theory. Of course, I would need to have one, but that's not my business. I'm just saying that a collection of causal patterns is painted in blue, and a different collection of patterns is painted in green, and those are the natural kinds. And the question is that so the homeostatic property cluster is not able to do the painting that some of the theories should.
Yeah, I don't think I was especially clear on all of this. I said something yesterday when I said I got into philosophy of neuroscience because I was worried about people doing experiments where they went looking for the female brain or the male brain or the gay brain and the straight brain. And I thought that there was something that somebody really ought to enter into that discussion and explain why perhaps these sorts of research projects are potentially really quite misguided, and cases in which we are bringing our own biases and presuppositions and reading them onto a structure like the brain that will sustain any number of interpretations. And so for me, part of what's at stake in all of this is being very honest about when that perspective is entering into our science, and recognizing that that happens, and that the science can't proceed without lumping things and splitting things. There's no doubt about that. But what I'm trying to do is to call attention to the fact that much of our lumping and splitting practices is driven by what we care about and what we're interested in, and that we should be aware of this intrusion of our perspective into the science. And that's, I guess, if there's really a take-home message from this, it's don't expect that the causal structure of the world will objectively tell you that these are two distinct things. The world will not tell you that. It will not tell you that there are gay people and that there are straight people. You have to come at sexual practices with an orientation that will help to carve that line for you. But the world will not carve that line for you. It's too messy for that. Just too messy.
So I would think that if you have a problem that you want to solve, and you have to, you want to know what the causes are for that symptom or for that sickness or whatever. And you say, well, there can be many mechanisms that can be working in different levels. And so, I don't know, maybe I'm a bit naive because I'm not on this field of cognitives. But I would somehow lay down all of the mechanisms that I could think of
all of the causes that work in such mechanisms, and trying to find the common causes that work in all of them, to start like pulling out essential causes, maybe. So, but, yeah. So, what would you say about that?
Yeah.
I mean, I would guess that is what people do.
I think that's exactly what they do. It's really, the take home from this talk is largely about this philosophical theory of natural kinds and whether that theory of natural kinds is tenable. I think psychologists, scientists of all sorts are looking for the causes. They are looking for what's common to all of the things that have this outcome and what's different, how it differs from these other things. The question is whether the term natural kind is useful in that pursuit. So I'm imagining, that the world is a cauldron of causal relationships, busy buzzing causal confusion. And then the question is, how do I go through and draw circles around all of the bits of that confusion that are like one another? And when I get to a certain degree of variability between what's in those circles, there's a certain judgment call. But that doesn't mean that we can't do it as the way that what I tried to say at the very end is that we can, of course, find commonalities. It's just that there might be commonalities in this dimension, differences in this dimension, commonalities in this other dimension over here, and that there's no uniquely correct answer which one of those should guide our lumping and our splitting practices. Schizophrenia might be one thing when you pay attention to one potential cause, many things when you pay attention to another, many things when you pay attention to the treatment regimens, one thing when you consider the economic impact, three things when you consider, right? And so in that sense, the world does not provide us with this approach, coupled with the world, does not provide us with a single answer to the question, is schizophrenia one thing or many things? It might well provide us with the answer, from one perspective, it's one thing. From another perspective, it's many things. And I think we ought to just be comfortable. I think most scientists are just comfortable with that. And I think that's partly why science can do so well. The biology and neuroscience, they don't know what natural kinds are. That's not a language that any of those people use. And it's a philosophical contrivance that we're foisting onto a science. And I think we ought to ask, is that the machinery that this science needs? And perhaps it's not. But when I wrote that paper with Ken Kendler on psychiatric kinds, I was really, I have so much respect for the people who do this kind of science, and I really hope that they will find those commonalities and find the relevant differences and use those well. And so, in beating up on this philosophical thesis, I don't want to tarnish the importance of doing this kind of experimental work. I just want to remove the idea of natural kind from it and perhaps allow us a little more flexibility in the kinds of ways that we might think about psychiatric disorders and lump them and split them for different purposes. So that's really what I'm after. And if I somehow suggested that I thought that was wrong or mistaken, I've sent the wrong message.
Well, for me, being a physicist and a realistic person, I would think that they should keep looking for those common mechanisms, like the core mechanisms that would be involved in all of them. Just from a physicist's point of view.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also prone to the thought that science is very hard, and it might. And we've been doing physics longer than we've been doing neuroscience, and it might just be that we, for cognition, have not yet gotten to where physics got a long time ago, and that eventually we will have the epiphany, and it will all make sense. On the other hand, I think when we're dealing with things in the biological realm, that the very mechanisms that we know exist of genetics and development introduce a kind of variability into that science that is very different, at least in degree, if not in kind, from the sort of thing that a typical physicist will deal with. And that makes the idea that there would be necessary and sufficient conditions very unlikely in this domain. And that we need something that's a little fuzzier, a little looser, if we're going to form useful groupings. And I'm still in favor, again, of finding, if it turns out that there is a genetic pathway that causes one kind of schizophrenia and a genetic pathway that produces another kind of schizophrenia, I think that's a very delightful idea, and I hope that they find it. It just turns out that at the moment it's looking more complex than that. And now I want to think maybe there's a way that we can still think about this science that would be productive and not throw everything out and just become conventionalists. Oh, it doesn't matter, carve it up however you want, lump and split depending on your interests. But rather something that's grounded in these causal considerations that you're mentioning. What makes things behave similarly and what makes them behave differently. But perhaps get rid of the idea that there's a single answer for all schizophrenics, that you might carve them into different groups, put them into different pigeonholes on the basis of different, you might find that difference-making feature that you're looking for, that there would be several of those and that they would carve the thing in entirely different ways. And I think given the complexity of biology, it's very likely that that's the way things are going to go.
We have 2 more questions in 5 minutes, so please both be concrete.
Carl, what about brain plasticity in relation with maker's knowledge? In other words, is not this maker's knowledge mirroring the plasticity in the brain?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So one interesting thing, and that's what's going on in the robotic arm case, is that we're making use of the plasticity mechanisms that are there. And in fact, these neuroprosthetics have become a real tool for understanding how plasticity works. And so in a sense, it is making use of that plastic structure. But now let's think about another of these recent advances that I mentioned very quickly, optogenetics. That's also something that brains can do with our help. They can become responsive to light, but we have to provide some virus for that. But and so I just want to suggest that there's a lot of nascent causal relationships. Besides, plasticity is certainly one of those things that we can use. And I think it's real, but I think there's a lot hiding in the brain. And that part of what we'll see in coming years as people find more and more ways to intervene in brains with things like optogenetics, is that there's a lot of nascent causal structure in there that we might actually be able to use. Not something that's used in development, not something that's used in everyday life, but things that with a little help from us can be linked together to do really amazing stuff, along with the plasticity that you're talking about. Yeah, that's right. Hi.
How would it look if instead of HPC we put mechanistic view in the conventionalism and essentialism graph you showed us? I'm asking this because I want to know more about this pluralism on view relationship, both for mechanisms. Do you think the same as for natural kinds?
Wait, I'm sorry. I think I missed the heart of the question. In the spectrum, so between essentialism and conventionalism.
Essentialism and conventionalism is HPC. If we put the mechanism view instead of HPC, how will it look? It will be more in the side of essentialism or conventionalism?
Well, what I was trying to argue is that the mechanism view and the HPC view are naturally made for one another. But that when you start thinking about what mechanisms are and how we tell when two mechanisms are mechanisms of the same type, or where one mechanism begins and another mechanism ends, that in fact we end up having to make certain sorts of judgments where our perspective enters into that picture. And so it slides down towards the conventionalist end of the spectrum. However, the way that I'm trying to save the day at the end is to say that it is true that what we decide that we want to explain or what we're interested in doing fundamentally shapes where in the causal structure we look to determine what the kinds are. It's still a fact that once we've decided what we want to do, treat schizophrenia, find the right treatment group for a patient population, improve a child's language capacities. Once we've set that phenomenon, that thing that we're interested in, then I do believe it's a purely objective. I think this is related to your question as well. Then I think there is an objective question to be answered. Is it the case that by changing this, I improve these patients? Is it the case that by changing this, I help people with their language learning? And to me, there's still a level of objectivity. I want this all to be anchored in a causal and an objective causal structure, where I'm suggesting that this intrusion of perspective enters is when we start taking those causal relationships and saying, oh, and these are a mechanism. That there it's unavoidable that what we put into the mechanism depends on what it is that we're trying to explain, and that's tinged by perspectives. That doesn't mean that everything's connected to everything else. There's still facts about the causal structure of the world and what causes what, and those we do not make that up. The world does constrain us in that way. What I'm trying to open our mind to is the possibility that the kind structure of the world of the special the kind structure in the taxonomy of the special sciences might fit that causal structure in many different ways, all of which are correct. So I think that's my attempt to state the view. And I said to somebody earlier today, you might get the perspective listening to this talk that I want to have my cake and eat it too. And that is exactly true. That's what I want. I'm an enthusiast for these sciences, but I think that the notion of a natural kind, that Boyd is, at least as Boyd is representing it, is one that's untenable. It's a perspective. It ultimately is a perspectival view.
Very last question. Yeah. No, you haven't asked. You want?
No.
Okay, then you go.
Well, sorry for being so insistent. Well, you mentioned two examples: schizophrenia and syphilis. Syphilis, we would say. We know the cause of syphilis, some bacterial infection by certain bacteria. Given this contrast between syphilis and schizophrenia, the contrast suggests that schizophrenia is fuzzy because we know very little, or we don't know enough. So we are clumping many things together. So that's the reason we don't have a natural kind for schizophrenia, because the distinction is very rough, we don't know enough. So my hunch is that it's just this fuzziness is a result of ignorance. Syphilis, we know enough to know the causal mechanism, and we know the causal mechanism is a bacterial. In the case of schizophrenia, probably we're clumping or clustering too many things together. According to schizophrenia, as I suggested.
Yeah, my point about syphilis was really about tertiary syphilis, and the fact that it manifests in so many different ways. It has a single common causal pathway that produces it that you just described, but the way that tertiary syphilis, you have an initial set of symptoms, and then it goes dormant, and then many years later it comes back, but it comes back invading your brain. And then when it's invaded the brain, it can produce all kinds of symptoms, and how it manifests in an individual person will be very different. So my point about tertiary syphilis was that if we look to the etiological pathway, we have one thing. If we look to the constitutive pathway, we have a separate thing. And that we will be led to lump or to split syphilis, tertiary syphilis, differently depending on which aspect of the causal structure we pay attention to. Similarly with schizophrenia, look, there's no doubt that there's commonality among many of the people who have schizophrenia. It's not the case that it's a different disease in each person that has it. The heredity of the thing gives me some confidence that there's a story to be told here about the etiological pathway, and I certainly wouldn't want to prejudge that there's no end to the science. The point that I want to make, however, is that it might be that we find certain bottlenecks that allow us to say that schizophrenia is one thing, and then we find various divergent pathways that would tell us that in fact there are many subtypes, and that for different purposes, paying attention to different portions of the causal structure of the world, we will be led to lump and split, and we might attend to different portions of the causal structure of the world for different purposes. If we're putting somebody in a discussion group, it would be one thing. If we're trying to figure out what the right drug to give them is, we're picking another. If we're trying to figure out how to prevent it from happening in somebody who's got the genetic disposition, we might choose to lump and split in an entirely different way. So my point is not that we now know on the basis of science exactly whether schizophrenia is or is not, and I'm not making any bets about what will happen to schizophrenia in the future. My question is merely with the idea that the causal structure of the world by itself, independent of human perspective, about where we look in that causal structure or which aspects of those causal structure we think are important for what we're trying to do, that the causal structure of the world will tell us, free us of responsibility for the judgments about when things fall into the same category and when they will not. And my suggestion is that the causal structure of the world is cases for the world to tell us when we're lumping and splitting in the right way, that our perspective will ultimately make a contribution to whether we've got the right lumping and splitting, and it will depend on what we want to do with the categories that we end up with. That's the point. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Carl.